I'm going to turn the camera off. Okay. Okay, got it. Okay, welcome everybody. We're just sorry about that. We've just had like 20 minutes of technical issues trying to figure out how to get sound to work on Zoom as well as in the room, but I think we're sorted now. And if anyone on Zoom has issues hearing, please just start writing in the chat if there's any issues as we proceed. But yeah, you're very welcome to this event about responding to sensitive disclosures from students. I'm Luna Dolezal. I'm Professor of Philosophy and Medical Humanities based in the Wellcome Centre over in Queens, and I lead the EDI and Research Culture team in the Wellcome Centre. And this is one of two events we're organising this term, and we're organising another one in December around trauma-informed approaches and their relevance to higher education. And I've invited Alice and Neil to come today to speak to us about the work that they've been doing at Plymouth and at Bath University around disclosures. I met Alice a couple of years ago when I sat on a commission against violence, about violence against women and girls at in Plymouth City Council, and Alice presented about this training that they developed at Plymouth University. And at the time I thought it was really interesting because as a personal tutor, I've received many disclosures, but have never received any training about how to respond appropriately or how to receive those disclosures. So it kind of piqued my interest, and so I thought it would be great to hear from neighboring universities about their practices. And Sarah is also speaking from the university's casework team to talk about our own university's approach to sensitive disclosures, particularly those around sexual violence and sexual assault. And yeah, really happy to have everyone here, and thank you for coming. This event is being recorded, but that recording won't be shared publicly. But if you know of any colleagues or anyone who had hoped to come to the event but couldn't make it, we can share that recording to interested people. So just to let you know that now. I'm going to hand over to Alice and Neil. They'll introduce themselves and give their presentation, and then Sarah will give her presentation after, and then we can have discussion. We've got an hour and a half, so there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's nice to see people in the room and obviously lots of you online. So very warm welcome from us, and thank you, Luna, for inviting us today. I'm Alice Ludgate, Director of Student Support and Safeguarding at the University of Bath. And when Luna and I first met, I was working at the University of Plymouth, but I've since moved, but very much the sort of practice has continued through the team at Plymouth and now into the work I'm doing at Bath. So really pleased to be here. I've always been interested in student support. I've always been interested in supporting victims, survivors of sexual violence, preventing violence against women and girls, addressing it. So this is a subject really close to my heart. I've worked in the sector for around 12 years. I've been a trustee of a domestic abuse and sexual violence charity as well. So I'm really pleased to be bringing the work into UK higher education and to continuing to sort of improve our approach to supporting students that have experienced sexual violence. So thank you for having me. I'll let Neil introduce himself.
Thanks, Alice. My name is Neil Gillett. I'm Head of Student Services at the University of Plymouth. So I used to work with Alice, and then when she left, I took over. And yeah, my team deal with wellbeing support, student advice, our front-facing student hub, but also the area of student conduct and also preventing harassment and sexual misconduct as well. I've worked in the sector for about 16 years now, and it was only when I joined the university in Plymouth that I started to kind of realise how much work there was going on in universities around this area. And then when Alice left, she sort of passed the baton to me. So we've continued that work, and that's really kind of strengthened my interest in this area. And a couple of years ago, we put in a application for Safer Streets 4 through the Home Office. And through those funds, we've been able to do more in this area. And one of those things we do, which I'll talk about a bit later, is the training for our staff. So I'll touch on that a bit later. But thank you for having me.
I'm Sarah Donaldson. I lead the university's casework team, and I'm nominally the lead of sexual misconduct for the university. So I sit on things like gender safety group. I came into this originally as a kind of student caseworker dealing with appeals and complaints. We had conduct that was relatively low level, but in 2016, when Universities UK said that essentially activity that may be a criminal offence that involves our students should be considered as disciplinary matters by universities. That kind of turned the dial somewhat on the nature of the work that my team and I do. And since 2016, the original experience there was, okay, this is a complete U-turn on everything we thought that we were dealing with. Once we got to grips with that in 2019, we then really looked at the work that we were doing in the area of sexual violence, and decided we need to take a look at this and think about a portfolio that's available to students, how students are going to access the supports. So I worked with a group of academics, of professional services staff, wellbeing staff, student groups and external reviewers to look at the provision that we had. It's become a growth area. I don't know if that's the right way to look at it, but it's the truth. And my team and I have expanded and see a great deal of work in the area of disclosures. I'm really excited to be part of this today. I'm really looking forward to hearing about what different universities are doing in this space, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some clarity about what Exeter and our approach is to this.
Thank you. Okay, fab, thanks. So if you see us just working through 3 screens, please don't be put off. It's all under control, but we are occasionally letting people back in the virtual waiting room, so thanks for bearing with. So it would be wrong of us to start a presentation like this, without doing some form of content warning, some sensitivity warning. So just to sort of pause on, how are you today? I'm not asking you to answer that question publicly, but just to take a moment to check in with yourself about how you are. What's going on for you? What have you brought into the room today? Because the topic of sensitive disclosures, we're talking about mental health, we're talking about sexual violence, we're talking about sexual harassment, and that might mean that in hearing what we're talking about, that you have an emotional response to that, and that's absolutely natural, that's absolutely normal. But if you do want to talk to someone after this, then please do bear in mind the support options that you have available to you, whether that's in work, out of work, entirely up to you, but know that you're not alone. And if you do want to talk to someone, then please do. I've had a look on the University of Exeter website and found the link to the employee assistance programme. So you've got support in-house, you have line managers, you have colleagues. Outside of work, there's other links here to charities and other organisations that would be able to help you if you did want some advice or support after today. So please do use them. And my advice is, it can be quite a heavy subject. We're all here as experts who can help answer any questions you have, and there is time for questions. I'll come on to the agenda in a second. But do something nice, do something nourishing for yourself today, after today, whatever it is. And if you need this talk as an excuse to do that, then go on and use it. But please do just bear in mind that it can be quite heavy stuff that we're talking about. Okay, so oh, sorry, more waiting room people. Welcome if you have just joined us online. So the format for today, I'm going to give an introduction to the topic, sensitive disclosures. What do we mean by that? I'm then going to talk about the University of Bath approach. No surprises, Neil's going to talk about that at Plymouth, and then Sarah's going to talk about the Exeter model and the support that's available here. We will have time for your questions, so please do note them. We'll come to them as we when we get to the end, but if there's something really urgent that you want to ask us, we're going through, that's fine, we're really happy to do that. And if you're in the online room and you want to type your questions, is somebody able to keep an eye on that? Charlotte, are you able to keep an eye on it on the chat? Fab, thank you very much. So that's the format for today. That clock's not working, so it's 1:10 and we've got until 2:30, so we'll use as probably the full just under 90 minutes now. So sensitive disclosures, what on earth do we mean by that, and where's it coming from? I guess what we're saying by the word sensitive is it can be subjects that are difficult for people to discuss or to disclose to someone else, and that might also be difficult for people to hear. We're going to talk about the approach of 2-3 universities in how we want and hope our staff will respond to such disclosures, and that's really what we're going to talk about today, how we are training and equipping our staff with the tools and the know-how and the skills to do that, grounded in the reality, which, as Sarah said, there's new guidance for the sector that's not so new anymore when you think back to the original Changing the Culture report from UUK, but there is far more awareness now of the reality of student life and some of the darker side of that, some of the experiences students have on campus, online, off campus, whether that's harassment, sexual misconduct. We are all seeing in student support services an increase in students presenting with mental health problems, those being increasingly complex. Sometimes within that mix, you'll have students who have experienced some form of sexual harassment and misconduct. But also universities are doing more to prevent this unacceptable behaviour and ensure there's support available to respond and react to it. So we'll talk about our institutional reporting tools, the support that's available for students, the support for staff, training, precautionary measures, disciplinary procedures. Those things are all there, and they are in response to what we know is happening at every higher education provider across the world. And I've just if you look online for student sexual violence, university culture, you will see so many articles and so much attention on this subject. And of course, what that means is that more people are talking about it, and wherever your vantage point is on your University of Exeter, you will have seen that. You'll have seen or heard about that increase in sensitive disclosures, and that could be harassment. I've listed a few here: sexual misconduct, rape, sexual assault, spiking. Sorry, another waiting rumour. And I do just want to pause and think about, this isn't a transaction of us imparting knowledge on you and then you going away and using that with students or other people, because there's lots of stigma, there's lots of stereotypes, and there's lots of barriers to someone making themselves known and saying, hey, this happened to me, or hey, I'd like some support. And we all carry with us our bias, our own lived experiences, our own sense of what some of these words mean. And part of the training that we've been doing at Plymouth and now at Bath is around really helping people understand what we mean by sexual violence, what we mean by sexual harassment, and ensuring that the lived experience of those people that have experienced any of those things is really heard and is really front and centre in our approach. So before I get into the how, just to say that we're not trying to overcomplicate this. I hope what you'll take away from today is an impression of how simple responding to a sensitive disclosure can be. And we'll talk about the training that we provide at our respective universities. So the reason I think we're all here is, who will students tell about their experience? I expect if you were yourself to think about who you would talk to if something had happened to you, you would come up with a list of people in your circle of trust, people outside of that. We know from asking students and our professional experience that these are some of the people that they would tell. They would probably tell a friend first. So the time you hear about something might not be the first time they've said the words out loud, but they might tell a friend, they might tell a family member, they might tell their personal tutor, their favourite lecturer, somebody who they think can relate to them and their experience, someone they trust, their halls assistant. You, show of hands in the room, could you be, or have you been in the position where you've had some sort of disclosure from a student? Yeah, I can't do the maths that quickly, but overwhelmingly majority. So all of us, being living, breathing human beings, will come to these scenarios with our own background, with our own experience, and with our own approach about how we think we should support students. But before we do, I do want to just show you a quick video, which I'm hoping is going to work through all mechanisms that we're using to present this. Now, I will say before, this video, every time I watch it, gets me. It's quite emotive. So settle in, watch it, and just, I guess, a bit of a pre-warning. It's quite an emotive video about experiences of sexual violence and why this is so important.
I was sexually abused when I was about 8 by an older male cousin.
I've been sexually assaulted on 4 different occasions.
I was 6 years old the first time that I was molested. A neighbor named Hank took me into his house. And at first it was hugging, and then his hands traveled. And when I tried to push him away, he beat me. And then he raped me.
And I was haunted by the fact that this happened in a little girl's bedroom.
For a long time, I blamed myself. I was just angry because I'd go to school
and nobody in school knew what was going on.
When I tried to tell my mom, she kicked me out of the house and laughed at me and told me I would never deserve anything better.
It became something that lasted until I was 17 years old.
I remember after it happened and after he left, sitting on a bed for a while, torn up and saying, I am never going to tell another living person about this. I went and got my friends and I drove them home.
Thank you for reading that, Katrina.
Thanks.
Now, if you had the chance, how would you respond to this person's story?
I just feel like, or just like hug her. And just let her know it's not her fault.
You were a little girl. It's not your fault, honey.
You actually have the chance to meet that person because they're here today. This is James Metters. This is Mark Godoy Jr. This is Isaac Andrade. This is Walter Castaneda. This is Glenn Hall. He served in the Army for 30 years, retiring as Command Sergeant Major. And what you just read is his story.
My name is Glenn.
What you just read was his story.
Oh my God.
How do you do?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for reading my story.
I know the statistic is 1 in 6. I'll go into a room and I'll count 6 men. Like there's somebody else in here, and they're probably dealing with it the same way I've dealt with it, which is not talking about it.
To share the same experience, I was young and I was in college. I was sexually abused. You know, we don't talk about these things, but it happens, you know.
I grew up in a Latino household where
I know what that's like.
my dad telling me, no llores, cabrón, no eres vieja, you're not a girl, don't cry. And on the other side, you're getting abused and you don't know what to say.
I joined the Army to die. I was abused from the time I was born till I was 17.
Masculinity made me put away what I was feeling and not really deeply feel what had happened to me and recognize and acknowledge what happened to me.
Getting suspended in the 4th grade, getting in a fight, getting expelled from one high school, it's all part of the abuse. And it's all part of me and my child, my inner child acting out and starving for attention.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons I rose in the rank of the military, they like tough guys, but inside I was dying.
Still makes me emotional. That what happened to me wasn't because of who I am. It was something that was done to me. It's not me.
I know a lot of males are too afraid to speak up, but I'm real open because I want to inspire the male survivors. That not just males with disabilities, but also males without disabilities.
I identify myself as a Black gay survivor. I had a lot of fear, and I just posted a link on Facebook saying, this is my story, if you want to read it, you can read it. And the response I got after that was nothing but kind.
Every time I share my story, especially as a man, I always hear back, hey, can I talk to you? Yeah, what's up? This happened to me too. This happened to me too. This happened to me too.
I'm not doing it just for myself. It's for many others whose voices not been heard before.
It's really hard not to cry. I'm really glad you've done the work, and I know that you changed somebody's life. So that's all I can say without crying.
You can survive it. You can get through it.
I think you're just so strong. Like, I don't know if you know it, but you're very strong.
Thank you.
It just makes you remember and realize that everybody has a story.
Okay. So, as I say, it sort of gets me every time, and we share that not to to make people overly emotional, but to say that just, I guess, to remember that sexual violence affects, irrespective of who you are and what makes you you, it affects everybody. And in fact, it affects some people more than it would others in terms of demographics. And we know people that are statistically more likely to be affected, particularly women and girls. But really, really important for us to just hold that in our minds. Remember, when someone's talking to you, see them as that whole person. And we will talk really tactically around, what you can say, how you can handle those disclosures. That's the whole point of our training. I'm always struck by some research that I became aware of, and I'm not going to be able to quote, which is terrible in a university, isn't it? Where it was sort of who conducted the research, but it was a study in the US around jurors and their ability to, or their emotional response to a victim of sexual abuse from childhood, who then comes to report that later on in life. And I think on average, male survivors of sexual abuse will on average disclose that 27 years after it had happened. And this research was around jurors, and when they see that victim or survivor, if they are then a fully grown male adult, that they found it harder to believe them, because it's probably through all the social conditioning we've all had, the image of the person you see as the survivor victim might be a young female, might be a young person, not this sort of grown male. So again, just remembering all of the construct of some of this stuff is within society. It affects and leads us to have our own biases, our own stereotypes that will be there. So it's about knowing that they're there and then still seeing that whole person in front of you. Okay, so thank you for watching that. Oops, there we go. I'm going to talk now about the University of Bath's approach. This slide hasn't caught up. Okay, there we are. Then we'll do Plymouth, then we'll do Exeter, and then we'll certainly have time for lots of questions. Probably some of what I say about Bath will be similar to what you hear about Plymouth, and will be similar to what you hear about Exeter, because there's really good practice around the sector, whole scale, and there's really good resources that universities can pull upon in shaping our response. So at Bath, we have a Never Okay awareness raising campaign, which is designed to say this behaviour is never okay. It's recently just had a name change. It used to be called Be the Change, which we hoped would be sort of inspiring around, change and learn. But actually, we found that the nightclubs and the sort of SU were saying, you know what, never okay hits harder, and that's what we want. So we've gone back to our old language of never okay. We, like others, have an online reporting tool called Support and Report. We provide compulsory training for students. So under that heading I just mentioned of Be the Change, it includes consent and how to be an active bystander. So that's compulsory. However, if for some students that training would be triggering and upsetting for them because of their own past experience, we absolutely don't expect them to have to complete it. And we're doing quite a lot of work on that. But to try and raise awareness and to try and prevent inappropriate behaviour, we have heaps of guidance for staff and students about sexual harassment, sexual misconduct. We have policies. It's enshrined within our student code of conduct and our regulations that if students are found to behave in this way towards another person, student, member of staff, etc., that disciplinary action can be taken, and it is taken. And one of the things we want to do is start to publicise in a very sort of anonymised way the number of reports that we've had and what's happened as a result of those reports. So where we've taken action to expel students, for instance, we want people to know that, because we want to encourage reporting. Very much a big thing for us is that we want to encourage students to come forward and tell someone. This is all new and emerging, so we want to move towards adopting a trauma-informed approach in how we provide student support. What was I going to say then? It's just gone out of my brain. So part of the University of Bath strategy, one of the 4 components is around creating and embedding a culture of care. So this feels like really neatly within that overall strategic mission. And these are some of the reasons why. So we want to acknowledge the overwhelm that we hear from staff, so personal tutors, support staff, residents, live, security, at oh my goodness, a student is telling me this, or they might tell me this, and I do not know what to do. I'm overwhelmed by that information. I'm not quoting them, but I think that's something we can all probably relate to. We also know that the impact of those disclosures on staff, if they don't have the resources, the skills, the knowledge to deal with them, can be really profound, can affect their own well-being, their own stress levels, their own, history of trauma, whatever that might be. So we want to acknowledge the impact of that upon staff. Point 3, the need for students to access support. So I always come back to the fact that we're providing education. We are places of learning. And one of the points of discussion I sometimes hear from staff is that, well, I mean, maybe not in the setting of responding to violence, but, when it comes to dealing with stress, well, students need to learn. They need to learn, because in the world of work, it's going to be stressful, and they're going to have to work long hours, and they're going to have to cope with this. It's absolutely right. But unless someone teaches them how to do that and gives them the skills to cope with that in a safe space, they will not flourish in that future world of work that you're describing. So, often recognizing that students have been themselves through something traumatic or difficult, whether they're struggling with their mental health, whether they've had an experience of sexual violence. I want to create an approach where a university is a safe space to talk about that, receive support, to move on and move through it in order to lead a healthy, fulfilling, successful life, whatever that looks like for them. Part of our approach is always around using the students' language, not substituting their words for your own. Always make sure that you're using theirs. Recognizing the impact of trauma upon individuals and their ability to ask for help. You saw in that video that one of the stories that was read out, the quote from the story was, "I'm never going to tell anyone that this happened." There are so many barriers to someone disclosing what they've been through, disclosing something that they feel might make them vulnerable, that they might be ashamed of. That was massive, massive work that Luna and others are doing around shame sensitivity, so important. But recognizing the impact of that on that individual, and really seeing universities as an important place and having an important role to help that student move through. One of our principles is certainly avoiding this temptation, maybe the feeling like you have to inquire to elicit more and more and more information about what happened when. Absolutely not. Don't ask for details. Focus on the student in front of you and what they need, but very much signposting. I want every member of staff to know that you can signpost, and you should be signposting students to specialist support, that you don't need to be that person. And I think this very crude smart art tool at the bottom is my way, and the wording I keep saying is, as a member of staff, whether you're a tutor, I don't know, at Bath we have student experience officers that work within the faculties and our school structure. Your anchor in the event of a sensitive disclosure is not knowledge. I don't need you to anchor to knowledge. I need you to anchor to a compassionate response. And that's that sort of shift that I'm really trying to make through this training that we're talking about. That feels, I hope, more empowering for staff. That's quite easily obtainable. You don't need to keep up to date with where's the nearest sexual assault referral centre, where's the nearest, I don't know, sexual violence liaison officer. Know where to signpost students, and yourself be anchored in that compassionate response. I've put a little plug here for the Trauma Informed Plymouth network. They should take up the whole slide. I have learned so much from working with the Trauma Informed Plymouth network, who really are leading the way in the UK around trauma informed practice. So they've trained me. I've got them working with staff in my team, student support and safeguarding at Bath, to ensure that we are trauma informed and can help spread some of these messages out to the wider university. We, like you all know, work in university, we have tragic things that happen. Sometimes students, are victims of assault. Sometimes students experience suicidal thoughts. Sometimes students die by suicide. We, like every university, experience those awful, awful situations. And in a review that we had, and we worked with an external consultant, I was new into Bath, and I thought, I need to just get some benchmarking. How are we faring? And I'm really happy with the support that's provided. But this quote in this 80-page report I'm sharing with everybody I can. So I just want you to read this. I'll read it out maybe. So, while staff cannot be kept aware of students' suicidal or other risks, by treating all students with compassion and thoughtfulness in every interaction, they are very unlikely to cause the student's well-being to deteriorate. A consistently kind approach is more realistic and achievable by all, because it's not possible to plan for every trigger or vulnerability. This talks to me, and actually, me personally, I've not followed a student services career path, so I'm not an expert. I'm not a mental health nurse by background. I'm not an occupational therapist. I'm not a social worker, and often I'm working with academics who themselves haven't come from that specialist background. And this is the anchor piece. This is about saying you just need to know how to respond compassionately, rather than with this really deep level of knowledge. And the reason I say this and really want to underline it is because I hear from staff this fear of, well, if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to cause that person more damage. I don't want to say the wrong thing and then their mental health worsen. I don't want to talk about it for fear that I'm saying the wrong thing. And so that's why I think this has been really powerful, and starting to talk to tutors and other people like that really has been really quite helpful. So quite practically, as I say, this work is in design, but these are some of the principles. I think we'll probably move, sorry, I keep moving away from the laptop, the microphone. Always remembering, this is for you all, for us all. Remember that the student may well be struggling. That's probably why they're talking to you. They may well be desperate and they may well be feeling lonely. And you could be the first person that they've told. That telling you that sensitive information, that sensitive disclosure, whatever, has involved them overcoming some barriers. We've got a waiting room. Have we got a waiting room? No? Oh, you're on it. Yeah. Fab, thanks. That's gone. Really, really importantly, always believe what you are told. In receiving a disclosure or someone telling you something, you are not there to judge whether that happened or not. You're not there to ask questions, starting with why. You're there to believe what that person is telling you, to listen compassionately, to be kind, and signpost to the specialists. You do not need to know all of their answers. Focus your energy, and Neil will say more and give some examples here, but focus your energy and attention on the student and their needs, where you can signpost them. And really importantly, if you find that conversation difficult, speak to someone who can support you afterwards. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about that anchoring yourself in compassion, and this is something we're starting to roll out now at Bath, and design this with academic staff, with support staff outside of central support services like mine, to really say what's going to be helpful to you. Okay, over to you.
Thanks, Alice. So, okay, what do we do at the University of Plymouth? So, as Alice alluded to at the beginning, we all have similar things that we all do. So we've got a code of conduct and disciplinary process. We've got a sexual violence and misconduct policy, and yeah, that gives us the framework within which we operate. We've also got a reporting support tool called Speak Up. We introduced that about 3 or 4 years ago, and year on year since we've introduced it, we've seen a steady increase in the number of reports coming through that tool. Could be because we've been promoting it more and more, but it is also, as Alice said at the beginning, there's more of it in society, there's more of it in the media. We also have and I'm terming it mandatory. We've introduced it this year for the first time. We call it mandatory, but it's sort of the first steps towards introducing this. So we've got consent training and bystander intervention training, and also an equality, diversity and inclusion e-learning as well, which we're asking students to do. But I guess what's brought us here today is the training which we offer. So we designed it a few years ago, and it's a 1.5 hour session for our staff. And it's about responding specifically to disclosures of all forms of sexual violence and misconduct. And the training's been really popular. It's optional, but what we see every time is we get a full house pretty much. We're doing it online at the moment, but we get 30, 40, mainly academic staff signing up to it every time, which is a huge success. Obviously, we've got thousands of staff within the university. And there's also a question about whether the people that are coming forward to that training are the people that actually need it. So we're constantly evolving that training, what we have in that training in terms of content and how we promote it as well. I'll cover a bit more of the training in a moment. Just to mention, we did a student survey a few years ago, and one of the gaps it did identify was that students overwhelmingly said that they weren't sure what happens after they make a report of sexual violence. So in response to that, we've done quite a lot of work to ensure that, it's clear what happens, and the training that we deliver is key to that, because it's important that our staff know. We also, so I mentioned the Safer Streets 4 initiative, which is the Home Office initiative. So we were able to bring in funds to the city, and we used that to introduce what we call sexual violence liaison officers. And these are quite common in the sector. And they are, well, there's different models in different universities, but at Plymouth, we have gone out to people in the university to say, do you want to volunteer your time to be a sexual violence liaison officer? And they get specific training from an external company, and they have to complete some exams and various assessments. But they then act as a point of contact for students who experience sexual violence, so that they're given one person that they can speak to in the university, so they don't have to keep retelling that story. And that's really critical, because otherwise you'll have them disclosing to a personal tutor and then having to go to our wellbeing services, and it's not good for that individual. So we've got those SVLOs in place, but they also act as a point of contact for anybody that a report has been made against as well. It's obviously not the same person, but we recognise that if you receive a report about you, then you're going to need support as well. So that's important. Another thing we've been doing over the past few years is we call it a Talk About Sex event. So each year around Valentine's Day, we do an event where we get people from Plymouth, external services, sexual advice, sexual assault referral centre, everybody into the university, and try and create an environment for students where they feel safe talking about sex, healthy relationships, issues around consent, and it's been successful, and I think what we're trying to get to is an environment where students feel safe talking about this topic, and hopefully through that we'll see a reduction in the number of reports coming through. So what do we do in terms of the process at Plymouth? So we have the incident, and we recognise, of course, that the student doesn't have to tell anyone at all. It's absolutely their choice. We won't force them to disclose anything, but they can also receive support confidentially if they want. So when they report something through our Speak Up tool, they can report anonymously, or they can give their name, and then we can support appropriately. So the policy signposts students and staff to support outside and inside the university. Many students don't disclose sexual violence and misconduct, so it's recommended that staff make students aware of the policy periodically, so that they can refer to it independently without having to ask. So we address the fact that there may be an incident, and that leads on to a possible disclosure. So disclosure means telling someone about an incident, and it might not be a formal report. It might be that they're talking to somebody that they trust and they mention it. And then the policy then gives guidance about how staff within the university can receive a disclosure, what to say, and where to signpost to. So that could include the police, it could include the Sexual Assault Referral Centre. And the training that we deliver backs this up, and it equips the staff to know what to say. The policy also deals with third-party disclosure. So a student might disclose on behalf of their friend and how to deal with that situation. And yeah, as I said earlier, the disclosure could be reported anonymously on Speak Up by staff or a student. And if it's anonymous, there's not much we can do unless we can identify a particular safeguarding risk, but it does help with our kind of data and keeping a track of what's going on in the student population. And then there's the report. So yeah, reports should be made on Speak Up. It goes over to the Code of Conduct and Disciplinary Procedure, which explains the next steps. We get an investigating officer, they investigate what's happened. It might be raised to a major misconduct panel, and then ultimately there will be some sort of penalty. It also talks about the impact of a police investigation on the university process. So where we're aware of the fact that police are involved, we will pause our own internal processes to allow that to happen. And we do recommend to students that they report to the police. It's completely their choice. We wouldn't do that on their behalf. And we do find often that students don't want to, they either don't trust the police or they don't want to kind of take the person that they're reporting about through that legal process. So then they come back to us and they ask us to investigate. And we've also got a procedure for handling reports where the responding person, so the person the report's been made against, is another student or a member of staff. So my team deal where the responding person is a student, and then we have a separate process which is dealt by our HR team. So that's kind of what we do in a nutshell. And then, so as I said, the training that we deliver is 1.5 hours, so I'm not going to go through the entire session, but it's an interactive session. We show the video that we did earlier. We ask questions of the group. We bring out facts and figures. And we also have a role play that we do, which it requires a bit of acting ability from the people that deliver it. But you could do it by filming it as well. But that's been really important for us because, as we said at the beginning, this is really, it can be really simple stuff. And so for the people in that training session to see and see a kind of demonstration of how simple it can be is really, really important. And I guess the next step for us is to think about how we might deliver sort of similar training sessions for other sensitive disclosures other than sexual violence or misconduct. Because at the end of the day, yeah, it's about having that ability to have a conversation which holds that person in that space before you signpost them. So this is just an example of one of the slides we present. So for many of you, this may seem like, you know, common sense. For some of you, it may come across as surprising. So, but what can you do if somebody discloses to you? So obviously listen, and importantly, allow there to be silence. And a lot of people can feel uncomfortable with silence, but it's an important tool to use in order to hold that person in that space and encourage them to talk if they want to. Believe them. So the person that's disclosing to you, it's important for them to feel believed. So saying to them, you know, I hear what you're saying, I believe you. And try not to sound shocked. I guess that's, in the moment, it can be quite difficult. But if the person disclosing to you senses that you're shocked by it, or you respond in a sort of surprised way, it might put them off from disclosing further. An important thing, and a lot of people ask this in the training actually, it's quite important not to physically console the person. I think it's quite natural, isn't it, when someone's crying, to go towards them, to either touch them or give them a hug. But in that moment, it's important, and it's important for those professional boundaries as well. Don't judge. So don't say anything like, oh, why did you do that? Why did you go out with a really short skirt on? You know, don't enter that space where they might feel judged, and let them stay in control. So it might be tempting for you to start asking questions. It might be tempting to, you know, quickly get on the phone to somebody, but you need to give them that space and let them control the situation. Don't ask for specific details. So it's their space, it's their opportunity to say what they need to in that moment. So it might be tempting to try and get a whole story, but it really needs to be up to them to come forward with that. And try and give them practical options. So obviously we build into the training session what those practical options might be. So it might be that you signpost them to the student support services. It might be that you say to them, you might want to go to external services. That could include the police, but you're not there to tell them what to do. You're there to empower them to be sure of what options are available to them. respect their decision. So if they say to you, I don't want to take this forwards, I don't want to go to the police, I don't want you to tell anybody else about this, then you've got to respect that. Obviously, if there are safeguarding concerns, then ideally with the student's permission, you would then agree to share that with somebody else. But yeah, you need to respect what they decide to do. Reassure them, so say to them, I'm taking this really seriously, you know, I've heard you today, and I am taking this seriously. So it comes back to this whole thing around believing them, and letting them stay in control and recognize their courage. So what we do say is to say to that individual that you recognize that it's been a really important step for them to do this, and to recognize that it may have been hard for them. And try and use their language, not your own. So if they say to you that an incident happened, don't immediately say, you know, that it's a sexual assault or it's a rape. It's important that you use their language. So there's just a few examples of things which you can do. It says there, make a record of what is said. So that's important as well. And what we do advise in our training session is that you try and follow up with an email of the advice that you've given and some of the key points. There's another quote here, which I think sums up quite nicely what just been saying about having that conversation. So Blythe Baird is an American poet, author and actress, and she writes a lot about things relating to mental health, sexuality, and trauma as well. And the quote here says, but when I talk about my trauma, I'm not asking you to carry it or relieve me from it. I'm just asking for it not to be too heavy for a conversation. These experiences take up so much space inside of them. So I think that's quite powerful. They're not asking you to take the burden of what they're saying to you and to do something. You're there simply to listen and then talk about next steps. So some helpful language that you can use. You can say things like, I don't need to know all of the details. We'll do everything we can to support you. I believe you. That's an important one. I want you to be safe. You deserve to be treated with respect. This is important. So this is, again, reinforcing that you believe them and that you're taking it seriously. And sometimes it's useful to ask them what they need in that moment, put it back to them and ask them, what do they need from you? They might say nothing. They might ask for some support in talking to somebody. So yeah, put it back to them and say things like, thank you for trusting me with this information, so they really feel held in that moment. And it says here, yeah, to make it easier, you don't need to say the name of the person they're reporting about, and just say that person. And an important technique, I think, is grounding. So I think sometimes it's good to, I guess, bring them back to where they are in that moment by saying things like, do you want to get a drink of water, or do you want to take a moment? So yeah, using some grounding techniques. So yeah, the training ends with a slide or two about staff looking after themselves. And I think Alice alluded to this at the beginning when we talked about this session, but we really do focus on this quite a bit because we recognize that taking those disclosures can be really, really heavy for the members of staff. So we refer to staff support, so things like employee assistance programs, their line manager, a peer or a colleague that they trust, a friend. And as Alice was saying at the beginning, yeah, encourage them to do something good for themselves and something that they know is important to their well-being. I think as a university, or Plymouth anyway, we focus so much on student well-being, and I guess we sometimes forget about staff well-being. So I think this is important for the people that are at that training session to remember. It's not just about the student, it's about yourself as well. So I mean, the as I said, that the training that we deliver is really well attended. But one of the things we found actually that it was mostly females that were attending, and there were not as many males attending. So we've tried various things. So we previously had just females delivering the sessions. So I stepped in, I did some of the sessions, and I think that has created a bit more interest from male colleagues. And yeah, we're always going to have that barrier of, I guess, staff who just aren't interested in this. And that's a problem when it's optional, because you might only get the people that are interested. You're always going to have those individuals who just don't see this as their role. And so, you know, that's a difficult barrier for us to overcome. But what I'm hoping to do at Plymouth anyway is, I mean, at the moment, the title of the training is responding to sexual violence. And I think that's probably quite a, I think it probably puts some people off. So when we move into, you know, delivering the training about other types of disclosures, I want to kind of change the name of it so that it's more around how do you support students, or how do you have a constructive conversation with a student. So that's sort of the next stage. So that's all from me. Thank you for listening. So this is Sarah.
If I can load my presentation. Yeah. Oh, that's correct. Right. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So yeah, I'm Sarah and I'm the lead for section misconduct for the university. Probably should have put my name on there so that you can remember who I am. I'm going to talk through a bit of the approach in response to concerns around disclosures. Am I not set up? Okay, I'll carry on talking. Essentially, the significant review that we undertook was in 2019 after we implemented a kind of a good attempt to respond in 2016 to sexual violence in universities. And once we'd had several years to figure out what we were doing effectively, by 2019, we realized that we needed to really reflect on what we had in place and think about forward planning. So in 2019, we took a look at the policy, the procedure, the processes, the people that were involved in supporting students around sexual violence. We had external review, and what we found in summation was that there was a lot of good practice going on around the university. There were a lot of people doing a lot of things to support students in a variety of different ways. But it wasn't holistic, it wasn't joined up, it wasn't together. And what student groups were telling us was that they were kind of falling through the gaps and having the experience of making a disclosure and then finding that they weren't necessarily getting quite the right response to it, and then potentially having to disclose again in order to access a new level of support. So although the support was actually there, because it wasn't holistically joined up together, students were kind of falling through the gaps. And so we started to think about what model do we want to put in place to support students, to make sure that we've got an identified offer, to make sure that we've got clear routes for students to access the support that's available at the university. And that model of support that sits mostly within wellbeing and within student cases and with Speak Out that existed at the time, it didn't work that closely together. We recognised that it had opportunities for all forms of harms, all forms of distress. So students who are experiencing mental health difficulties, as well as students who are experiencing violence or sexual violence. This model that centred around a kind of casework management process was the best way to ensure that students who are really struggling had the opportunity to make sure that they had access to a tailored programme of support. And central to the model that we introduced at that point was a commitment that students should only ever have to disclose once in order to access the support that was available. We wanted to try and minimise the number of times somebody would have to say, I'm struggling, before the support was being offered. Doing it on screen. That changed. Okay, I got it. Thank you. So within the good practice that we identified was that commitment to asking for one disclosure to trigger a response that was targeted to the student's needs, a victim survivor-led trauma-informed response, which we already were doing, but we wanted to codify that in our response in this area. We wanted to identify what was a clear and well-defined offer for students who experience harm or distress. What was our response going to be? What was the provision that we wanted to put in place for students? And what was going to be the clear and well-defined route for those students to access that offer? And so we identified that by going to a minimized, streamlined process for students to access support, to make us aware that there was something that they needed a response to. And as we've seen with Bath and with Plymouth, we implemented effectively a two-columned kind of approach of support and report, with support being the primary kind of route into the provision at the university. So support centering around the welfare of the individual, and reporting generally centering around a planned intervention, which might, if the harm was caused through sexual violence, the reporting would be around responding to the person who was responsible for that harm. So that was looking at the provision. What welfare support would we want to put in place? And I'm going to speak about that a little bit more in a second. And the reporting centering around what response can we give if somebody has experienced harm and they're a member of our community. But in terms of that being the planned provision, how do students then get into that provision? Given that they were telling us they were making disclosures and then finding that they weren't necessarily getting a clear response to that. So the three routes in essentially being wellbeing services, the Exeter Speak Out tool that I'm sure colleagues in the room will be well aware of, and via my team at Student Cases. So the clear identified offer and the clear routes into accessing that offer. So the support column, the weight is carried by wellbeing services, if I'm completely honest. The wellbeing services, for colleagues who don't know the provision especially well, is made up of different pathways of support. So there's the accessibility pathway, which students may have already engaged with before they've arrived at university, because it's centered around disability. So if we've had a disclosure of that before arrival, there may already be provision in place, but that may be something that's diagnosed whilst they're a student here. And that may be something that comes through as a disclosure. So if a student has a need, we then want them flagged into accessibility. Wellbeing, alternatively, is looking at things like CBT related kind of response to mental health and emotional well-being. Sometimes there is a need for that level of support alongside a student's studies. There may not be otherwise any harm or distress present, but a need for some level of wellbeing support alongside the students' access to their education. The welfare pathway, which is a kind of more short-term crisis-led response to a situation. So if we've got real concerns that somebody is struggling immediately right now, there is a welfare pathway where staff can work with the student and their GP. They can talk to a student about whether or not they need to go to hospital, whether they want to talk to the police, whether they want to talk to student cases, reviewing their safety arrangements on campus if they're concerned about someone that has harmed them, for example. That there's separately health, wellbeing and support for study pathway, which you might know through the education welfare advice team. So that's sitting alongside a student who, for whatever reason, needs a little bit of extra support that's specifically targeted around supporting their studies, as well as the residence life support that's in our halls for those students who are living with us as tenants. So if a student discloses something, a referral into the wellbeing services is that support column. It may be that that student's needs spread across a range of those pathways, but there'll be a triage response to that, and that will then be identified and led by the student's needs in terms of what of that level of response that report generates. then the reporting column isn't going to be appropriate for all students, because if something that they're disclosing relates to harm that happened before they came to university, there's no action that the university would be able to take in terms of a response to that person who caused the harm. But if the person who's caused some harm to the person who's speaking to you is a member of our community, whether that's a staff member, whether that's a student, then there are procedures in place for that person to be able to report, and we can then take action forwards if that is something that they want. But that victim-led, trauma-informed aspect is front and center of our minds. Just because someone has told us they've experienced harm doesn't mean that we're going to take that situation forward on their behalf. But if they are experiencing harm because of another student or because of a staff member, there is action that the university can take if that's what that person actually wants to have done. Alternatively, we can support them with thinking about options like reporting to the police. Of course, it's completely legitimate to also recognise that somebody may want to talk about the fact they've had a difficult experience, but they actually don't want any action taken. If it looks like there's going to be a report because it's a member of our community that's caused harm, the response that would be given under the report column would be an informal meeting with a member of my team to talk about what their options are around reporting, what that actually would look like. We would talk them through precautionary action that we could put in place against the person who's caused the harm in the event that they're a staff member or a student. That means thinking about, should that person be coming to campus? Should there be a limited access to campus for that person? It's intended to put some restrictions in place against the person responsible while we take forward an investigation to give the person who's experienced the harm the space and the freedom to be able to take that case forward if that's appropriate for them. And that could then lead to a form of disciplinary action after an investigation has been completed. In respect of disclosures and our commitment to the fact that somebody should only have to disclose once, part of what we gave significant consideration to in 2019 and we feel is working really effectively is what we actually mean by a disclosure, because a disclosure can mean a range of different things to different people. And what we were hearing from students at the time was, I disclose, nothing happens, I disclose, nothing happens. What we were also hearing was, I don't know what I need to say. I don't know how much I need to say. I don't know if I need to say anything at all. But the first trigger to get access to that support and reporting offer is that we need to know that someone's struggling in the first place. So we started to think about effectively simple disclosures versus formal report disclosures. The difference being a simple disclosure, I'm struggling, I've suffered harm because of someone else. Thinking about that, and as has already been explained by Alice and Neil, it's not about asking questions then about what's happened to you, who's responsible for what's happened to you. It's about sitting back, letting that person say to you, I'm struggling, and listening to what they say. A formal report disclosure is looking at the detail, the who, the why, the what, the when, the how, and that's something that should only ever happen in a formal context setting. It could be that it's something that's discussed as part of a therapeutic intervention that's planned and is done in a safe context, but it's something that could happen as part of an investigation, which is again planned and done in a safe context. But the simple disclosure of I'm struggling, I've experienced harm, that's what you might find that you're hearing from a student. And what we have is guidance for staff around how to navigate that. But essentially, from our institutional perspective, the simple disclosure is all we need to hear in order to trigger that support option. And the formal detailed reporting is only something that would come up in that formal context. So the guidance that we say, and again, I feel like I'm going to be repeating what's already been said, it's about listening to that person. It's about giving them that space. It's about understanding they'll have had a barrier to come in talking to anybody in the first place. Alice is right, it may not be the very first time they've ever said anything to anyone, but it's possibly the first time they've said it to somebody in a professional kind of context. So it's about listening. It's making sure that you're articulating a sense of belief in your body language, in your responses. Part of the reason why we don't want people asking questions, somebody may be re-traumatizing themselves whilst they're trying to describe something, and we want to avoid that happening if we possibly can. We want to articulate belief. I hear you, I believe you. How can I help you? And it's about reassuring that person that they are heard, that they are believed, and that there is support available at the university for them. That's what we want them to hear. But when it comes to what happens with that disclosure, it's about making an assessment in your own mind. You're trying to convey belief, hearing, reassurance, but you're also assessing what will I need to do with this disclosure once we've got to the point where that conversation is reaching, what can I do to help? What can I do for you? It's thinking about what's the next step going to be. And again, those clear lines of reporting in, and then signposting the student on. So you've got a student who's disclosing that they're feeling really isolated, that it's really impacting them, that they may be thinking about dropping out, or something more significant than that. It's thinking about, okay, this student sounds like they're really struggling, and I would like to reach out to the welfare team and get an intervention in place. And ideally, the student's going to say, that sounds great and I would really like that, but then they might also say, no, I really don't feel comfortable, which is fine. Confidentiality is really important. It's also important for staff who are hearing disclosures of this nature for your own well-being to think, I need to know I can sit with this because the students just told me this stuff, and I need to know I can sit with this, and it's okay to reach out to the cases team, to the wellbeing team, and say, can I just, on an anonymous level, just go through something that I've handled with a student, just for my own peace of mind, to make sure that I've navigated it. And then we can talk that through, because that might be part of your self-care. But ideally, you've gotten some form of disclosure, you haven't asked any questions, but you can hear that there's a need, and you've then signposted the student to speak out to wellbeing or to student cases, depending on what you've heard. So in order to make sure that the student receives what would be a tailored experience, we would be receiving wellbeing student cases, speak out. Once we've got the student with us, we want to ensure that they receive a tailored response of the offer that's available to them, depending upon their circumstances. So when students are talking to you, it's important that they give you enough information, but that's relevant to your role, because the nature of conversation that my team and I would be having with a student might look very different to the kind of conversation that a tutor might be having, or somebody in halls. So for most people outside of wellbeing, speak out, cases, estate patrol maybe as well, a simple disclosure, that's what you need, just to identify what the need is and where the onward referral needs to go. We're trying to protect students from disclosing more often than they have to, ideally no more than once, and disclosing any more than they absolutely have to receive the appropriate tailored support for them. It's safer for the student, it's safer for staff to make sure that you're receiving only an appropriate disclosure, where we're not actually trying to pick and dig into the detail of what was there in a context that isn't planned for that conversation to happen. I feel like I've brought a really heavy tone to this now. But that's essentially, from a purely a disclosures point of view, that's the sort of space in which we're sitting. We want to make sure, because there is a lot of support here for students, that they get there as smoothly as possible. That's me.
We'll revert back to our slide. Thank you so much. Okay, bear with folks. And we've got time now for questions of all of us. I've also put Neil and my contact details here, so feel free to make a note of those, and I'm sure we can get the slides to you afterwards. But has anybody got any questions in the online room or here?
There are, we've
Oh, we
collected
have
several of them.
okay.
Because of the microphone issues, if you do have any questions in the room, I'll have to repeat them back here. Yeah, again, because of the issues. So yes, Kat.
Thank you so much for this. It's really, really helpful. One thing I was wondering about is that you mentioned in the context of Exeter that you really encourage students to speak to someone, to disclose to someone where it's part of their role at the university. And of course that's very helpful, but it doesn't happen that way. So for context, I'm a PTA, and I think often we spend a lot of time with us in the smaller group. And you know, I'm closer to my student age than some of the other stuff, and they need me a lot, and I get a lot of often it's very competitive. We don't necessarily take it forward, but we come up with sensitive stuff at the time. And I believe it prevents them from doing that. Or do I necessarily want to cut them off and maybe say something experience like, oh, sorry, actually I'm not deal with it. It's quite complicated. And in the context of that, I'm also wondering, you know, this is the first time I've heard about what kind of quality and health matters. I don't know if this is because I don't know if it's provided to other kinds of staff, but not PTAs. But I think that it sounds like there is a bit of a gap here in terms of providing adequate support to staff, even if you know we're not supposed to be the ones who use the degree of demand.
Yeah. I don't know if you need to repeat the
So
question.
I'm typing it up for the chat, but essentially the gist of it is what happens when somebody who's receiving a disclosure doesn't have it within kind of their job description to receive that disclosure, but rather is, I guess, more accessible to be disclosed to. And this happens particularly with PTAs. I'm also a PTA. That's the gist of it.
And in terms of role, I think what I was trying to articulate, but obviously not very well, was that when we're receiving disclosures, we need to think about the role that we're actually performing in relation to the student. So thinking about that difference between a simple disclosure, which is listened to, believed, reassured, and navigating that space as opposed to getting into a dialogue about what it is that there is to disclose, if that makes sense. And I totally get that you can't ever predict where a disclosure is going to come, and people will find whoever they feel comfortable with to talk to, but recognizing that there's a difference between your PTA role and a supportive welfare role. There is a difference between those, and trying to prevent a situation where we get into a dialogic, questions asking, almost investigative level of conversation with somebody. That's the level of thinking about the role that we're navigating and what's appropriate in that situation. I think that's what I was trying to convey, as opposed to there are those of us who are within our roles. We will have those conversations, but they're always planned conversations, and then we've got welfare sitting around that because of the re-traumatizing nature of some of these conversations. So it's a perfectly legitimate question, and I think there is probably a next step for me to take forward in terms of thinking about how we're communicating this to colleagues who are supporting students.
Thank you.
Mm. Yeah.
So if I just say, oh, I've heard you, and then send it out to the place that I know they're not going to use, I feel like I can't do anything at the moment, but anything else because I don't do.
Yeah.
But I feel like I'm abandoning my duty. So that's the concern I have, where I much understand that it's something like, you know, my training never do it way, that there are situations where I know they will not be following up with the proper body within the university.
Yeah. So I think what we were
we're trying to cover there is when somebody talks to you and you know they're not going to follow up on the support option that's available. And I think there are two aspects to that. The first is that that's completely legitimate from the perspective of the person who's talking to you. That's entirely legitimate. They may never want to talk to anybody else, and that is their decision. We're victim-led, we're trauma-informed, we understand they need to be in control of where this goes next. The other issue there is your own well-being and thinking about the fact that you've received a disclosure, and what you then do in terms of, I heard you say their duty of care is then thinking about, do I need to have a conversation on an anonymized basis about what I've heard, and the fact that I have, or I can provide that signposting, but I have concerns they're not going to follow up, because that's a really difficult thing to be sitting with and thinking that's sitting with me. And your own well-being and thinking about how you discharge that and feel that you're sharing that load is also an important element of what you're describing there. Does that make sense?
I wanted to follow up Neil's point about a number of staff not being interested in this training. I'm a psychotherapist. I've worked with so many staff who have had weeping sexual abuse themselves, and I strongly suspect that they avoid these trainings because it triggers their own experience of abuse. And I really want to come and talk to you afterwards, Sarah, at some point, about whether we can contribute anything towards that, because we have a university department of psychotherapy training, and we need to be, amongst other things, training our own students about how to think about this.
Yeah, we can talk.
Yeah.
But Neil, I think, do you want Neil specifically to comment on this?
Yes.
Or...
I mean, it's a really good point. We create a space in the training at the end, and we say in the trigger warning at the beginning that we will be available at the end for any staff that are impacted by it. So we have had situations where staff have stayed behind, and we've supported them with ongoing signposting. But yeah, you're right. That could be an additional barrier. There are lots and lots of barriers to accessing this training, and yeah, it's something that maybe I can take away and also talk to similar colleagues in my institution about that.
Statistically, it's highly likely. When you think about the prevalence of sexual violence, that people, members of our community, staff will have experienced it. So it's absolutely right that will be a barrier for people coming forward and wanting to take part in the training. And similarly, when students make disclosures to them, that affecting their response.
So this is a question from the online room for Alice, from Lisa, and she says that she agrees with the sentiment that you expressed about kind of securing kind of the compassionate response as opposed to just the knowledge base, but that sometimes we are delivering bad news, so finding the balance between compassion and the facts of those bad news can be tricky, and what kind of advice you could offer for that.
Sorry, no, that's fine. So finding the balance between
being compassionate and perhaps moments where you have to be delivering bad news.
Okay, well, I always love to quote Brene Brown when I can, which is clear is kind. And I think it's always really, really important when you're delivering news to someone that you think they might not receive well, because it could be upsetting, not what they've wanted. Always be clear, listen, ask how they are, don't keep them there too long. I definitely wouldn't want in this promotion of compassion us to lose the importance of the point or the conversation we might be having with that individual. I think sometimes, and I think earlier on in my career, you're trying to maybe deliver bad news, and I probably did waffle around it before getting to the point. So I think really getting to that point in a clear way is part of being kind, would be the way I would put it. if that answers the question.
Yeah. This is a question for all of you from Laura, about how to measure the success of the measures put in place in each of the institutions, or in any institution for that matter.
Yeah, it's really hard, and I present at our board of governors every year about the statistics, and they always ask the same question. They say, well, when is what you're doing going to mean there's a plateau in the number of reports? But it's such an ever-changing environment, and the Office for Students is possibly going to make this a condition of registration. So we have seen a slight plateauing of reports around sexual misconduct, but now the Office for Students are saying you need to make this even more front and center on your website. So it's really, really difficult, because I think there will be another spike, and it's difficult to know why. Is it because there's more prevalence in society? Is it because we're promoting it more? So it's not really an answer, but it's just acknowledging that it's really difficult.
I think for me, a really tangible outcome would be, of those people that come forward to disclose, what is their academic outcome? Are they continuing? Are they completing their degree? Are they completing it within the the requisite number of years, or are they at some point suspending, or even worse, withdrawing? And I think they're both, that's a really hard edge to it. That's sort of the student academic outcomes we're all here for. So that would be something I would look at, as well as the lived experience then of those people and their qualitative, if you like, feedback on the support that they've received.
Yeah, there's a challenge in the qualitative feedback, though, in terms of how to unpick someone's journey once they've been through a process of some kind, without re-traumatizing them by revisiting the situation. And that's a kind of a hole that we haven't yet managed to fill. But I'd agree with Neil in terms of seeing increase in reporting should be a measure of success, not something to be afraid of. We've seen since 2019 an increase in the number of students who are talking to us about reporting situations, going on to report situations. So I think our measures are, if we take that as a measure, we are seeing a response to the work that we're doing. It is a society, sexual violence particularly is a societal issue, and so I don't feel that the numbers are going to go down. Our communities recycle for the most part every 3 or 4 years as students graduate and new students come through, and I think this is just an area of work we've just got to keep plugging away at it, and accepting that we just need to keep improving on how to put front and centre, as the Office for Students expects, what our position is on sexual violence and what our response on that is going to be, and keep dealing with people as compassionately as we possibly can.
Yeah, and to bridge on to that point that you were mentioning about kind of students re-traumatizing themselves and the Exeter policy of one single point of disclosure, this is a question that also latches onto Kat's question about who it is appropriate to disclose to. And it's from Laura. It says, when Sarah talks about the promise of one point of disclosure, does that mean from the point of disclosure to professional services rather than if a student discloses to academic staff?
To the university.
The university. Yeah. Brilliant. This is a composite of a couple of questions that came up. Is there a clear line between not asking, so it's about kind of the difference between simple disclosures and formal disclosures, and if there is a clear line between asking for more questions, as in the formal disclosure, and our duty of care to protect that person from harm, and also to maybe understand what the most appropriate signpost would be, and also that you mentioned the decision to not report the incident, that it must be respected. Is it right to do that if a crime has been committed?
Oh, that's a headache we'll all see. It is really difficult. If we're going to be victim survivor led, then we have to respect the decision of the person who's disclosing, and that can feel really counterintuitive and uncomfortable if what they've told us is something that could amount to a criminal offence. But we can't compel them to take part in any process. We can't compel them to go to the police. All we can do is respond compassionately and acknowledge that it is their right to choose what happens next. Sitting with the knowledge that someone has told you something that could be that significant, there's also a moment, I think, of panic. What do I do? I know this information. And again, that's why I would say those reporting lines of Speak Out, Wellbeing and Cases are so important, so that we can identify who we can share information with, even if it's on an anonymized basis. As a member of staff, hearing that, we can think there's somebody I can talk to and just manage my own sense of burden, that I know this and I'm absolutely confident this person isn't going to do anything significant with that information, significant in the sense of reporting it on. I don't know if
there's probably some exceptions to that. So if there was like a suggestion of terrorist activity, there might be other things like the prevent duty which come into that, are safeguarding duties. So yeah, I think there might be a handful of exceptions to that.
And I think, you know, the point behind this is that if someone's been a victim, has survived sexual violence, at some moment in time, their choice and their control was completely taken away from them because of what they've experienced. And so philosophically, it's really important that we ensure that they have that regained, or that when they speak to us, they have it. The exceptions are, as colleagues have said, if they or someone else is at risk of harm, then you do have a duty to share it with a safeguarding officer. But apart from that, it's about supporting and signposting that individual so they can make the choice about what happens next.
Any questions, additional questions from the room?
Yeah, just to clarify, when you break that confidentiality, I've got to navigate most of my career, so things are doing things.
Yeah.
It's sometimes about the anonymized sharing and that sense checking with colleagues in Cases Wellbeing, or speak out what it is you've heard and what you're navigating. You're not breaching confidentiality by having an anonymized conversation about something that you've heard, and that way you can sense check, have we reached the point where I need to disclose this information anyway? The general rule of thumb that I think we're probably all aware of is, yes, I can keep your confidence as long as it doesn't sound like you or anyone else is at risk of harm, and that's a pretty good guideline. And if we did hear something where we thought, I'm going to have to disclose this, and you want to walk that with the person that you're talking to and saying, we'd really like to do this with you, but at the same time can recognize this is going to be really challenging. And that's thinking about then Cases Wellbeing probably, and having those conversations. But you can sense check that anonymously. You wouldn't be anonymous, but you can do it on an anonymized basis, so that you can feel like, yeah, we've reached that threshold, or we've not quite got there. Does that, yeah.
We promote that all the time, and we have, you know, staff will phone into student services and say, can I talk to you about this scenario? And we say, yeah, that's fine. And then we, usually with a member of staff sort of we'll make the decision, right, I need to know that student's name, or no, I don't. Yeah. So yeah, please do. Don't hold it. You know, if you're not sure, ask.
There's a last question for Neil, specifically about the Plymouth approach. Grace is wondering more about the provision of the Talk About Sex event, if it's in person, online, how it's advertised to students, or if it's for the entire body, student body, or like university body.
We introduced it 3 or 4 years, I think it was when you were still at Plymouth, and I think it was just before the pandemic. So we had one event which was all in person on campus, and then we went into the pandemic. So we did an online version. And then last year we did it in partnership with Plymouth Marjon University and Arts University Plymouth as well. So it was a joint effort. So it's been a bit different over the past few years. One year we had a whole week. Last year we just had a day. But yeah, the idea is that it should be on campus, encouraging students to engage with us, with external services, with each other.
Brilliant. So I think that brings us to a close. Thank you very much, Alice, Neil, Sarah. Can we have a round of applause for our panel?
As I said, this was recorded, the Zoom call was recorded. So if you have colleagues that might be interested, please just email Charlotte's email, I think is on the Eventbrite, or the Wellcome Centre email, and we can distribute the Wellcome Centre email. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll just log out of this.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for doing all this.